Gurumurthy joining you live from the News Centre in Mumbai. Joining me in Delhi is my colleague Supriya Srinath. Now, time has come to tax the untaxed, widen the tax base, and most importantly, lessen the tax burden on the salaried middle class, who've been the favourite whipping boy of government after government. Whenever there's a fiscal stress, the great Indian middle class has been the weak target, shelling out nearly 50% of the take-home salaries in various taxes. The basic idea behind a new tax code is to provide a level playing field and withdraw all exemptions except for the basic exemption up to a limit. Against this backdrop, ET now raises some big questions. Why are the rich farmers going untaxed? Can't we have a stricter compliance code to ensure that the big fish don't escape the net? And in the age of Aadhaar, can tax evaders not be trapped and punished more effectively?
Indeed. Now, ET now welcomes the government's decision yesterday to set up a task force to rewrite the tax rules of our country. In fact, your favorite channel will be there on the forefront of this campaign for a balanced, transparent tax system that treats the evader with a long stick and reduces the burden on the middle class. In the run-up to the new direct tax code, which will replace the more than 60-year-old Income Tax Act, we are launching a campaign which we are calling ET Now Tax Pledge, with an aim to throw up new ideas and themes that leads to an income tax law which is fair to all. We kick off our campaign with a discussion right here on the India Development Debate this evening, and we're going to welcome a stellar panel that's joining us right here on the show tonight. We've got Shaktikanta Das, former DA Secretary, former Revenue Secretary as well, Pranav Saita, tax partner EY India, Atul Deshmukh, CA, Arthakranti, MR Venkatesh, political analyst, Prasenjit Bose, economist. And thank you very, very much, gentlemen, for joining us right here on the India Development Debate. We hope to put the spotlight on a very, very meaningful issue, on an issue that impacts us all, because we're all tax-paying citizens of this country, and an issue that's very, very close to our hearts here. Mr. Das, thanks very much for being with us, and I think congratulations are sure to come your way with the 15th Finance Commission nomination very soon, and we'll have another chat on that. But to begin with, and to talk about taxes really, in a nation of 130 crore citizens, 9.8 crore individuals file their tax returns. You know, I'm just going to repeat it for the benefit of our viewers. 130 crore Indians, 9.8 crore Indians file their tax returns. We've got about 14 lakh registered firms, 6 lakh file returns, 3 lakh say they are making losses. Less than 50,000 people in this country claim to earn more than 1 crore rupees. Only 50,000 people in a country of 130 crore. What will this be accounted for? What will this be attributed to? Why are we such a hopelessly tax evasive society, Mr. Das?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just probably repeat. I just wanted to say that, you know, I was hearing your introduction and I do not agree. I mean, let's not make this discussion into a middle class versus the rest. But having said that, I quite acknowledge and agree with you that any taxation system has to be balanced, has to be transparent, and the tax base has to be wide. Now, for a wider tax base, it requires better implementation. It also requires a good law, and as many people as possible who are liable to pay taxation should come into the tax net. Now, you mentioned that in India about 9.8 crore tax returns are filed in a population of 130 crore. So, it's 9.8 crore if you are, I mean, I think you are referring to individuals. So, if you take an individual to represent a family, and even giving allowance to the fact that there could be more members in the same family who are filing tax returns, the actual number of people, you know, assuming about 3 to 4 persons per family, the actual number of people who are within the direct tax net, I would feel that it's about 30 to 40 crore persons in that range. So, therefore, that is the number we have, and now the question is how to widen the tax net. You have in India, we have in India large number of exemptions. Exemptions have been given for industries, it has been given for charitable institutions, and there are other exempted categories also. So, now the government has announced 2 years ago a roadmap for phasing out the exempted categories. So, I think once that happens in a progressive manner, I am quite sure that the tax base should widen.
Fair point indeed, Mr. Das, but just to clarify, I mean, these figures, we're all quoting from the budget speech of the finance minister. You were, of course, part of the government back then, and even the finance minister in his budget speech last year acknowledged that India is a tax evasive society, and I'm again quoting from his speech. And so we want to sort of have this conversation on why are we tax evasive as a society and what can we do to improve that. That's the idea. We don't want to make this a middle class versus non-middle class issue. But M.R. Venkatesh, slightly provocative question to you, since you are usually provocative with your answers as well. We're a country full of patriots. We're a country full of nationalists. India is a country where if you don't stand up for the national anthem in a cinema theatre, you're called an anti-national. Why is it that those who don't pay taxes are also bracketed in the same anti-national category? Why is that culture not there in this country?
For that, sir, you should have visited the income tax office, sit down before the income tax officer. I am sure even Mr. Saktikanta Das has not gone for an income tax assessment of his own income tax return. Only when you go there, you will know what is the hardship that you face as a taxpayer. In this country, probably we are the only country where you require a chartered accountant or a lawyer, the services of either of the two professional to even file your tax honestly. And even if you file it, you are not sure, because even after the Supreme Court comes out and says that what you understood of the law is the correct law, there could be a retrospective amendment to the law. So there is always a Tom and Jerry game that happens between the taxpayer and the tax collector. And I always believe that because of the superior intelligence, intellect and the time that we have amongst the chartered accountants and the lawyer fraternity, the taxpayer has been the Jerry and the tax collector the Tom. But having said that, I fully agree with you that we must respect the law and there is no excuse for us to do away with the law. But having said this, also I must add, those who are also saying that we must improve our tax base and go about for increasing the tax GDP ratio must understand that we are transferring the wealth from the hands of the most productive sector, namely the household or the corporate, to the most unproductive sector, which is the corporate, which is the government. So we also have to decide what is the ideal tax GDP ratio that we require. And in my humble submission, tax GDP ratio must come down. Government must get away with its yojanas. Government must do away with unnecessary expenditure. And it is very simply done. If you want to simplify the Income Tax Act of 1961, declare Chapter 4 and Chapter 6 here to be out of the books and say 115 JB, which is the minimum alternative tax, as the main section. You can do it in a jiffy, and that is what the finance minister suggested in 2015. And he said the other provisions will be rolled out by 2020 or 22, when all these existing allowances and deductions will be grandfathered. If you simply do this for corporate tax and say I will collect 22% on your book profit, I think 90% of the tax litigation will come down. This can all be done, and you don't have to have 3 experts sitting on a new code. And what we saw in the old direct tax code was a very, very good grammar book which converted the active voices into passive voice and passive voice into active voice. There was nothing new, no fresh thinking. So in my humble opinion, that if really fresh thinking is coming, a fresh approach to taxation is taken, the entire tax department is re-engineered, and there is some sort of friendly approach by the department. Why not? We can try it.
No, you raised a couple of points there about the department being not so friendly, and also the fact that you're talking about, those exemptions going away and tax rates coming down. But there's a bit of a doublespeak even on the part of Indian industry. When the finance minister announced that, we did see the industry being divided over that issue, and that's one of the questions that we will be dealing with a little later in the show. So do bear with us as we go with this flow. But Pranav Saita, let me come to you. There are only, and I appreciate the fact that you're putting some really out of the box, perhaps if I may call revolutionary ideas on the table that may not find favor, because while you say that a lot of it is going to the unproductive department, which is the government, people may turn around and say that that's also a contractual obligation as a part of the democracy we have towards the government. We can't expect them to spend always. But anyways, and I'll touch upon that, I promise you. But Pranav Saita, there are only 76 lakh assessees who declare income of more than 5 lakh rupees in India, out of which 56 lakhs are the salaried class. What will it take to widen the tax base and ensuring that the salaried middle class were to pay lower taxes? I think the sum and crux of the argument that has been made, and the one that I want to carry forward with you, is what will widen the tax base?
I think to a large extent the entire history of taxes in India, and while taxes are the price we pay for civilization, the historical tax rates have been so high that a mindset has been created that evading taxes is not unethical or anti-national and so on. So, I think over the last few years taxes have been rationalized. Second, I think to a large extent the administration has to be fair and reasonable, and the experience of the taxpayer has to be good when he is interacting with the tax department. Third, I think there has to be a fairness even today about the taxes. If we are not going to tax rich farmers, and if the salaried class is going to have to pay such huge taxes and bear the primary burden of the tax, then obviously that mindset of nothing wrong in evading taxes is going to get further entrenched. So, there has to be a fairness in the way taxes are levied and collected. There has to be a reasonableness in the way in which a good experience that the taxpayer undergoes when he interacts with the administration, and there has to be a reasonable fair tax rate. And the fourth point I would point out is the way in which the taxpayer's money is spent. The taxpayer should feel that it has been spent on the development of the country, on construction of roads, infrastructure and so on and so forth. If it is well spent for social security of the poor, I do not think by and large Indians would mind paying taxes. That is my view. And if that kind of administration which is fair and reasonable, tax rates which are reasonable and fair, and to an extent money well spent by the government is shown, I think over a period of time tax base will improve. Of course, as I said, there will be situations where there will be smaller businesses, farm incomes, either the tax law does not apply to certain categories of incomes like farm incomes and so on,
right,
or there is a class which would avoid tax or evade tax because it is able to, the smaller mid-sized businesses in particular.
Okay.
That's, I think, the area that needs to be addressed.
You know, Pranav Sethia, you've raised three of the crucial points that we need to debate in this program. One is there a case to tax the rich in the agriculture sector? Two, is there a case to bring down rates to increase compliance? We've seen that happen in several countries. Is there a reason to do that? And three is how can we improve the interface with the tax administration, a point that M.R. Venkatesh spoke about as well. These are three crucial points that we need to cover in this debate, and we would cover much ground if we do justice to these 3 points. But before I do that, Prasenjit Bose, you know, demonetization and GST, the whole world has spanned demonetization. Everyone has criticized demonetization, including you. And I want to ask you, are these two reforms, both demonetization and GST, if you were to see the wider construct of moving the country towards a formal tax compliant economy, were these game changing reforms? Is it fair to say that both these reforms which have been opposed have led to a behavioral change in mindset? Today people are far more optimistic of getting more people into the tax net because of just these two reforms that have been undertaken by the government. Prasenjit Bose.
Well, the GST was clearly an initiative that was taken by the earlier government. The demonetization thing was something which this government had brought out of its hat suddenly. But even this direct tax code, there was a bill which the previous government had prepared. It had gone to the standing committee. The standing committee had given a report. So I don't think that this is something which what the government is doing now in terms of this new task, setting up this new task force. I don't know what this new task force is going to come up with, but there is already a proposal for a new direct tax code on the table, which the government could have, you know, just gone ahead and implemented, which was a lot of work had been done by the previous government. Now, I think that there are 3 or 4 issues. First of all, you know, some of your panelists are, you know, ill informed. They should know that India has among the lowest tax GDP ratios in the entire world. I mean, you look at not only the developed countries, but even BRICS countries, India's tax GDP ratio stands around 17 to 18%, which is among the lowest. And we are also having today among in terms of the tax rates, the personal income tax rates or even the corporate tax rates, we are also, you know, quite low. I mean, if you look at European countries, on an average, they have 50% plus income tax rates. Even in many, you know, even in the United States or China, you have 40 to 45% of income tax rate, whereas we have around 30% plus, you know, slightly, you know, if you add the surcharge and all that, it will be slightly more than that. So, this entire idea that we are among the more overtaxed countries in the world is a completely wrong idea. So, I don't think that there is absolutely any case for any cut in tax rates. There is a very strong case for widening the tax base. And as you have correctly pointed out, the rural rich in our country, They have been kept outside the tax net for a very long time, for decades now, and they are the obvious, if one is really talking in terms of bringing, widening the tax base in a significant manner, that is the section which should be, targeted. And it is not only the rural rich. A lot of people I know, I mean, for instance, one of the most famous, actors of our country, who is very rich, everybody knows, he had claimed himself to be a farmer a few years back. We all know about a piece of agricultural land in the state of Uttar Pradesh. So these loopholes have been deliberately kept people to get away by not paying taxes, and I think that those loopholes should be closed. But there are more issues. There is an issue of doing away with the myriad the corporate tax exemptions. I mean, if one is talking in terms of tax simplification, which I strongly support, in that case, why should there be so many tax exemptions, which complicates the tax structure, makes compliance more difficult? And just hang on. And then, there is another very important issue which has not been touched upon. You are just interrupting me.
Just 1 second, Prasenjit. You've raised you've raised two important points. Let's discuss that and come back to you for the third point that you want to make. The corporate tax point is an issue that we want to touch upon because there is a bit of a double speak. Even we at TT now believe that. So you've raised important points. I'm going to come to you in just a bit and discuss the third point that you were making. But Mr. Deshmukh, Artha Kranti believes that there is a genuine flaw with our existing tax system, and you've put forward some very radical solutions on the table. What are those? Help us understand what's the rationale for those radical suggestions that you're making. First, make them and then quickly explain us the rationale.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity given to Artha Kranti first. The proposal which has been proposed by this Artha Kranti Pratishthan to the Government of India is a 5-point proposal. And the first one is withdrawal of the existing taxation system completely, including the direct and indirect taxation, except the custom duty or the import duty, what we say, the first point. The second point is introduction of a new taxation system in the name of banking transaction tax, that is BTT, which is proposed to be right now at 2% for the every credit that comes into the bank of every saving account or the current account or any account, and which will contribute to a great revenue of the Government of India. The third proposal is there should not be any tax. I repeat, there should not be any tax on any of the cash transaction. And number 4, withdrawal of the high denomination currencies note. And last is, and government should make the legal provision to restrict cash transaction beyond rupees 2000, so that every transaction beyond 2000 in cash would not get any security. So this was the basically 5-point proposal given to Government of India.
Fair enough. Let's get a reaction from Mr. Shaktikanta Das. Radical as it may be, any of it feasible? I mean, is it fair to the banking transaction tax of at 2%? Is it fair to have the similar incidence of taxation on the rich and the poor? Any of this feasible at all? Any of this, but practically can it be considered by any government of the day, Mr. Das?
No, I think the suggestions require sort of deeper analysis, but at this, in this debate, since we are talking in the background of the new task force which government has constituted, and considering some of the points which have been made, very relevant points, I must say, have been made by the other participants in the discussion, I quite agree that that there will be two aspects to the current exercise, or there will be two aspects to any initiative on taxation. The first aspect relates to tax administration, the second aspect relates to tax law, and both have to be sound and robust. I agree with the point which was made by an earlier panelist that the tax administration, particularly the interface between the taxpayer and the tax official, that interface has to be cordial, and in fact a physical interface case should be avoided and should be reduced and possibly avoided. And I think number of steps have been taken in this direction with regard to, especially with regard to online filing of returns, online assessment, online refund. So a lot of initiatives have taken in that direction. With regard to tax law, I would like, my suggestion, the way I look at it is that the current task force should focus on two aspects. One, as the press note from the government says, is to review the existing tax laws, particularly look at the exemptions and the exempted categories. Charitable organizations, I think there are a large number of charitable organizations. Of course, many of them do play an important socio-economic role, but I think that whole chapter needs a proper review. And the roadmap which has been announced by the government for phasing out of tax exemptions, etc., that plus some other sections which also give other kinds of exemptions, that has to be looked at. The other aspect of any, first, apart from the review of the existing tax law, I think the language of the tax law, the drafting of the tax law is also very important. Because if you draft a law which leaves certain loopholes or which creates further confusion or ambiguity, that would again lead to lot of litigation. So I am quite happy that this task force has been constituted, because some of the existing provisions of the Income Tax Act which exists from 1961, a single section runs into pages after pages after pages, and it's very difficult for a common citizen, even for chartered accountants, to read it and understand it fully. You have to read it several times to understand what is the point that is being made. So I think the tax law also needs to be simple, direct, unambiguous, so that it does not lead to unnecessary litigation and confusion, and it also should not give any kind of discretion to the tax officials while implementing or while administering the tax law, because any kind of discretion would lead to other kinds of problems. It may lead to corruption and other kinds of things, which I think we all agree that is not at all desirable.
No. Oh, absolutely. And I think that's a very important point that you're raising there, and we will discuss that in just a bit. The litigation that's pending in all kinds of courts in India on account of taxation alone. But I think we've got a quick caller here. We'll take that call because this is an emotive issue, and we're getting a lot of queries and calls right here. Besava Raju from Bengaluru joins us. Go ahead, sir. Make your question.
Good afternoon. Just I wanted to ask the government secretary that what are the steps the government going to introduce to lessen the harassment to a genuine taxpayer, and the strict actions to be taken for tax evaders. It is common practice that a small direct honest taxpayers are being harassed, and the big players are caught free and they are evading easily with the connivance of the tax officials.
Okay. M.R. Venkatesh, you want to take that question, because I think you made that point early on in your opening remarks about how the tax department perhaps is not the friendliest place to be at. Do you want to quickly take the question in terms of suggestions that you'd like to make to this panel on how to ease harassment, if there's any?
See, as Mr. Das said, the problem is with the interpretation of the law. That is absolutely convoluted. Double negatives used in a sentence, and you always start most of this bigger section by saying a non-obstantive clause, then go on interpreting certain phrases. All these are cumbersome drafting, and if you can simply say that this is what I want to do or you don't do, and you are clearly told what to do and what not to do, I think half of the litigation will come down. Second, I think the whole of the problem is on your deductions and your exemptions. As I said, if 115 JB is made the base, you can reduce around 100 sections in the Income Tax Act and say just pay 22%, 25%, whatever is the rate that we all agree on your book profit, and be done with it. And every company pays 22, 23%, 20% of the base book profit tax. And whether they have to pay 34% or whether they have to pay lesser thanks to the deductions and the exemptions is creating another set of litigation. So everybody has to pay 20%, and at worst you have to pay 34%. So how do you bring 34 to 20? You take exemptions and deductions, and that is where the whole cat and mouse game comes in. The third area where we have to look at is transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is per se a black hole in our tax system, and I must say, in all humility and full responsibility, it is the most potent source of corruption in the tax administration. Unless that is streamlined, we are not going to go any further. Last but not the least, discretion. At every stage, we have increased discretion to the assessing officer. And at times, we have now even legislated. In 2017, we have come about and said that he need not owe any explanation till the courts come in, which will be around 10-12 years later. At every stage, whether it's the Commissioner Appeals or the Income Tax Tribunal, they cannot look at question certain actions of the assessing officer. This, I think, discretion must be stopped. The income tax officer owes the nation a sense of responsibility on the action that he takes, and people must be taken to cleaners for shrill assessments where they make some high-pitched demand, and that gets stuck down immediately at the Commissioner Appeals level or even at the tribunal level. So long and short of it, accountability, responsibility, simple drafting, mark your laws very clearly and say this is what we want to do, and also see that at best that the honest taxpayers like you and me are rewarded by a lower rate. That is what I want. Please understand, for last 20 years I have been paying honestly my taxes, and what do I get? I get notices and I have to sit down with the department to prove that my income is correct, and,
right.
and I have to take services of a chartered accountant or a lawyer.
Right.
I don't think so. This is what we should do. We should put the department more after tax sheets.
Absolutely. The department should go after what we are calling the tax chore and not the honest taxpayer. That's, you hit the nail in the head. But, Pranav, you made this point a little while ago on the case for lowering a tax rate. And there are economists, Surjit Bhalla, who's now a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, has made a case for a flat rate of about 18%. And he believes that could dramatically increase compliance and in turn tax collections. And, it cited the example of countries like Hong Kong, even Russia, where they moved to a dramatically lower tax rate, which led to a sharp increase in tax collections. Is that feasible in a country like India? Is there a case for us to bring down tax rates sharply in an effort or in a hoping that compliance will increase? Pranav.
I think it's been proven world over, internationally as well as in India, that once tax rates are made more reasonable, the compliance increases dramatically, and actually the tax collections do increase rather than reducing. As counterintuitive it might sound, it is a fact which has been proven time and time again across the world. So I don't think there is much debate around that. So far as the Indian tax rates are concerned, I think that on individuals, by and large, the highest tax slab of 30% does not look too much out of line with most countries in the world. So I don't think there's much room for reduction. Maybe surcharges and cess can probably go. But other than that, I think the individuals, the higher slabs probably might still be reasonable compared to what we see around us. Especially for corporates and businesses, I think the direct tax rate does have a lot of room for reduction. I would feel particularly for corporates where there is a tax rate of maybe 30% plus surcharges and cess, there is certainly room for reduction if we see across the world today, whether in developed countries or some of the countries in our continent, Asia as well. And we compete today, our companies compete today with companies all over the world. So we live in one competitive global environment. I think the tax rates must be brought down to at least 25%, if not lower. Yes, exemptions, incentives, etc. can be brought down by and large, except to certain focused areas like research and development, which we might really want to focus on. So I think corporate tax rates definitely call for reduction. For individuals, the tax slabs can be enhanced, but at the highest rate, maybe the rate can remain similar without surcharges and cesses. So far as corporates are concerned, I would again say that there is a lot of duplication of tax that arises apart from the corporate tax rate itself. There's dividend distribution tax, then there's cascading of dividend distribution tax as well, unless the dividend is being received by a company from its subsidiary, which means holding of shares of more than 50%. So there's a lot of room for rationalization of corporate tax rates, in particular taxes that businesses pay, whether corporates or firms, I think should be brought down dramatically to encourage further investment, job creation, and certainly make them competitive in a global environment.
Okay, fair point indeed. But Prasenjit, I'm going to turn to you and talk to you about the elephant in the room. It has been mentioned in passing, which is taxing agricultural income. And there are two ways and you know, 2 points to that argument really. Professor Bibek Devroy made one such pitch and the entire government machinery got down to deny any such move. So obviously it is politically a very sensitive move and perhaps that is why it happened. But the counter argument to that is that, you know, there are rich farmers. I know 99 million units of 121 in India are held by small and marginal farmers. But there are rich farmers and research reports seem to suggest that if you just tax the top 4% of the agricultural households, who own more than 4 hectares of land, the government can mop up close to 25,000 crore rupees. Now, while I believe that the poor and the small and marginal farmers need to be taken care of, what about the rich farmers? Why are they getting away with paying no taxes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, so much as research have already taken place to show that in India over the past 25 years, income inequality has, you know, increased very sharply. It is on the one hand because this huge, you know, the rural rich is not being taxed. It's also because, you know, people, they claim, you know, policymakers claim that cutting taxes is going to increase in tax revenues. It has never happened anywhere in the world. And there is absolutely no case whatsoever, either in terms of, you know, sort of the specific question that you are asking. There is a very strong case for expanding the tax base. But, you know, there is another elephant in the room, and that is the Indian corporate community. You know, it is so appalling that calls are being made to cut corporate tax rates in India, whereas in India the corporates are paying taxes at a rate.
I think we've lost the link there with Prashanjit. He clearly has a strong view on corporate taxes and the fact that there's no case for them to come down. He actually believes they should go up. That's a contrarian view indeed, even though the government also in principle believes that corporate taxes need to be brought down. But Mr. Das, let me bring this to your attention. Since you've been in the government, you've been involved so closely with policy making, why is taxing the rural rich such a taboo? Why is it so difficult for the government to move in that direction? Or do you believe that it's not such a significant opportunity? Because, you know, research seems to suggest that there is a potentially massive revenue upside for the government. What's your own sense on why this cannot happen in our country?
So there are two aspects to it. The first aspect is, I think this would require a much wider consensus within the country. Not only a political consensus, but also a wider social consensus about taxing agriculture, which has been exempted right from the beginning of the tax laws which we have. So that's the first point. The second point is, I think, as it was mentioned earlier, I would like to reiterate that more than 90% of the holdings are small and marginal. Obviously, it would be very difficult to, and I think in a society like considering our socio-economic milieu, the question of taxing this kind of small and medium farmers, I think would not, that whole idea would not fly, and I think it also may not be desirable under the current circumstances. Now, looking at the small minority of the rural rich, that, as I said, I think that would require a much wider consensus. And but other than agricultural income, if they have other income, then obviously that is taxable and that needs to be taxed. I mean, that is taxed even under the current regime, and that taxation will have to be captured.
Fair point indeed. It requires a larger national consensus and it can't just be a political move. In any case, many people believe it will be a politically suicidal move to make. But Mr. Deshmukh, you know, enough and more has been said about corporates. Prashanjit talked about it, Mr. Venkatesh talked about it, Mr. Das talked about it. The point really is that when you look at corporate tax rates, it's good that they come down. That's what the government wants, that's what corporates want. But the review of exemptions is where the problem occurs. I mean, look at what happened the last time around. The government said, let exemptions wane away and then we will bring down the taxes. The moment the government was going to do that, corporate India Inc. itself got divided. You know, people wanted exemptions to stay on for R&D, people wanted exemptions to stay on for pharma research. So, in some sense, there is a bit of a double speak even at the end of corporate India, is it not?
Basically, the exemption itself has created the problem in the Indian taxation system, and I believe, and Arthakranti also believe, that all the exemptions should be withdrawn immediately. Rather, the Arthakranti believes in withdrawal of entire income tax itself along with the indirect taxes. Just now, Mr. Das and Mr. Venkatesh Kumar both have agreed and told that there is a lot of confusion in income tax. There are lot many sections running into pages. There are so many rules, so many forms the assessee has to fill. This will be about if the income tax itself is abolished, then there will be no need of filing and doing any such jugglery also. This is only because of the exemption, the all jugglery is being done, and then there is a leakage of the revenue. And this is exactly the reason why there is every time the deficit, 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 but nobody has given any thought of this on this radical solution which Arthakranti has proposed. I think that taxation abolition is the best solution in India, and the transaction tax, the levy of transaction tax will do, and will only the India will only survive on this.
Pranav, you want to come in on this whole issue of exemptions for corporate India, because clearly, you are in a minority here in the panel, because everyone believes that there are too many exemptions for corporate India, and of course, Prasanjit has made a strong case for corporate taxes to go up. Pranav, a quick counter from you before we take a short break.
Right. I'm sure there will be always differences of opinion, and certain corporates who might be losing out on exemptions or incentives might not be in favor of that. But I think by and large, corporate India would be willing to give up the exemptions, incentives. Very few of those actually remain to a large extent today, I think anyways. But except for maybe research and development, if we want to focus on that as a country, to bring in the best brains and the best research and development activities, I think by and large, incentives, exemptions, if they go, I think corporate India overall should be fine. But there has to be an immediate and lasting reduction in tax rates genuinely. It shouldn't be that tax rates are reduced and then we have surcharges and cess and so on. If the all told tax rate is reduced, I think there would be a general acceptability of a withdrawal of exemptions and incentives. We must remember that most countries that Indian corporates compete with have tax rates today which range between 15 to 25%. And we are talking of an Indian tax rate at the corporate level which is probably sometimes as high as 34%. Which just does not leave the competitiveness available to Indian corporates. So I think a reduction in corporate tax rate has to come through. Once that comes through, I think a simultaneous withdrawal of most of the exemptions and incentives would be acceptable. The other thing that I mentioned also is that there should not be any other hidden corporate tax rates, whether it is in the form of surcharges, cess, dividend distribution tax, minimum alternate tax or whatever. There has to be a clear 25% or lower corporate tax rate, and I think withdrawal of exemptions, incentives should by and large be fine.
Back with ET now. This is a fascinating India development debate on taxing the tax chore. We've got an interesting question coming in from a caller from Lucknow. Naveen Tiwari joins us on the phone line. Mr. Tiwari, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I'm surprised to this argument about increasing the tax rate and comparing the tax rate with the tax rates in Europe and other countries, developed countries. It absolutely sounds absurd because we don't know the complete details about the tax rate, what benefits the taxpayer gets there in those countries, social securities and things like that. So unless we have a complete picture of those things, we cannot compare our taxation with their taxation. One. Second is what you are showing, the data that you are showing on your screen constantly points against that argument of increasing tax, because from 2012 to 2017, you have shown an increase of 10,000 crores in the tax net, and also but the tax rates have not changed as far as I know, and it has increased because there has been an increase in the tax base. 1,000 crore new taxpayers have been added.
Sure.
So this itself shows and proves that by increasing the tax base, you can increase the tax net. You can't increase the tax, the income by increasing the tax rate.
Okay.
The higher the tax, the less the compliance there will be.
Sure.
This is my argument. Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Dave, that was the view of one of our panelists, and we couldn't agree more that increasing the tax rate is definitely not the solution. But, MR, coming on this anguish, of which a lot of people have. On the one hand, there are people who may talk of increasing tax rate, but the larger question is, what do people who even pay taxes get in return, in terms of social security benefits, in terms of quality of infrastructure? And that explains the anguish of the salaried middle class. The fact that, they diligently pay taxes year after year, interface with the tax department, which is not necessarily always friendly, and yet they don't get the quality of services in return. Supriya spoke about the contract between the government and the taxpayer in a democracy, but the larger question is, what is the taxpaying citizen getting in return?
See, the fact of the matter is we can't actually attribute a direct correlation between the tax that we pay and what is the return for me personally. Understand the defense budget or any of the bigger budgets that we run runs on your tax and my tax. So to that extent, we have to pay our taxes, and we may all have differences on the tax laws or the tax rates. But whatever it is in a democracy, we all have to subject ourselves to the tax laws and pay our taxes honestly. But what should be the ideal tax GDP ratio? On this, I had a point of view that we should lower our tax GDP ratio, because what we are doing is primarily the household, which is the most productive sector, or the corporate, which is the most productive sector. We employ people, we save, we invest, and we do everything in the economy. We take money from the hands of this corporate sector in the household and give it into the hands of the government to do what? MNREGA, to do what? 7th pay commission, to do what? To do all these yojanas. Many of these things can be trimmed, and when you trim down the expenditure of the government, you can also bring down the tax of the tax rates and the tax of the entire structure. You can bring down the tax rate, and probably you can bring out people out of the tax net also. We don't have to also look at it. We can have a totally different view. Why should we go on taxing? I don't understand why we should tax charitable institutions. They are doing what the government does. They are feeding people. They are taking care of the people. They are taking, so of course there will be bad apples. But charitable institutions per se should not be taxed, is my view, and we have got stringent conditions to see that they adhere to it before they take these exemptions. Once they adhere to this, I see no reason why they should be brought into the tax net. Likewise, you take rich agriculturists. Now, there is nothing called rich agriculturists. I don't think so that any political party in this country, we are around 600 of them, is going to bat for it. Apart from having discussion in the studio channels, this will die the moment this program ends. So we are not going to get into that. But we should never, we don't talk about the ideal tax GDP ratio. Scandinavia has 50+% of tax GDP ratio. Can we afford that? Can we transfer the wealth from our household to the government and hope the government transfers services back? In this country, this is never going to happen. 70 years of our independence has shown us that the babudom and the bureaucracy is not going to be pro-friendly, pro-people, pro-poor, whatever, pro-country also. So we need to fix an ideal tax GDP ratio and say thus far and no further. Try to bring people out and see that the productive sector of the economy are kept productive and they are not taxed unnecessarily. This requires a larger debate. I hope that this is not that I feel that this should be the ideal rate. I feel there's a larger debate on.
Right.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, fair point indeed, and I don't think the discussion on agriculture will just die after this debate. It will perhaps also be denied by any government of the day. But Mr. Das, you had earlier pointed out towards the other part of this whole tax code being rewritten, which is to keep the language simple, to keep the language clear so that there is no interpretation, there is little litigation. I mean, what explains the fact that we've got 3,90,000 pending cases against the income tax department in various courts across the country? What is the way out of all of those? I mean, so much of time, energy is actually spent on this, which could be spent more fruitfully on other things that the government handles.
You see that the pendency of litigation reinforces the point which I was making, that the tax law itself has to be simple, because any ambiguity or any loose end in a tax provision, it leads to different kind of interpretations. Then there are so therefore any tax law while drafting, the task force has to focus and ensure that the provisions are tightly worded, and they are very simple, they are very clear, and leaves no ambiguity, or it leaves out minimum room for interpretation. Even then there would be interpretation, no doubt, but the room left for interpretation should be minimum, because that is the only way you can reduce litigation. Since I am on this point, I would just like to make one more point. I think you had made a reference, Supriya, about the mention in the budget speech that India is a largely non-compliant, tax non-compliant society. I think what needs to be done, particularly since the task force is going to review the existing tax laws, I think what needs to be done is to look, because in India there is, I am not going into the debate of tax GDP or whether our tax rates are high or low, but the basic point remains that there is considerable amount of tax evasion and tax avoidance. Now, demonetization and GST together have created a platform, have created a milieu, have created an environment where I think the tax evasion, the room for tax evasion or avoidance will get considerably minimized. But while drafting the new law, while reviewing the existing tax law, it's very important to ensure that there is no room left for tax evasion and tax avoidance, and at the same time the discretions left to the tax officials, because I can I appreciate the concerns expressed by all the other participants, and I think the thrust of the government is also to give very, very minimum discretion to administrators, to government officials, because any discretion may lead to other kind of complaints. So therefore the task force also has to ensure that the discretions given to tax officials are kept to the bare minimum and kept to only those areas where it is absolutely necessary and not beyond that.
Pranav, that's a very important point that Mr. Das made. The fact that we need to do all we can to widen the tax base to ensure that there's a crackdown on incidents of tax evasion, and yet that has to be done without giving the danda to the tax department, because everyone believes that the interface with the tax department is just not good, no matter what we do, and then the fear of tax terrorism keeps coming back. How can that be done by this committee, the task force that's been constituted to rewrite tax laws? Is it just by keeping them simple, non-ambiguous, removing all ambiguity in the tax law, make it more black and white, eliminating the shades of gray in the tax law? What needs to be done to ensure that we improve our tax compliance and yet do it without giving the stick to the tax department?
So I would feel 2-3 things really. One is, and there's no rocket science here, but one is to try and reduce as much as possible all kinds of uncertainty. Every taxpayer likes a certain amount of certainty, stability, predictability in how the law is going to be implemented. Second, I think very clearly as simplicity and discretion simplicity comes in and discretion goes away, and we have more certainty, predictability, stable tax laws which are not fidgeted, changed every year, routinely. What can also be ensured is that there's a certain amount of accountability. Just as the taxpayer, if he does file a tax return which avoids certain tax, conceals certain incomes, is going to be penalized, there has to be some element of accountability so far as the tax administration is concerned. The other point I think is that there has to be a quick disposal of appeals, and to a large extent if we see most appeals get decided in favor of the taxpayer, which shows that the kind of orders that are passed by the revenue authorities are extremely high pitched and sometimes create frivolous demands, which is because of the large pressure probably that comes from the government itself for tax collections, reducing fiscal deficit, ensuring that revenues grow at a certain rate and so on. So that needs to be adequately addressed. There should not be undue pressure on the tax administration to collect tax at whatever cost to meet certain fiscal deficit requirements. And to a large extent I feel that the administration should also ensure that routinely matters are not kept on being litigated and appealed upon. We find that every time the revenue loses an appeal, it wants to appeal to yet another higher level of appellate authority and carry on the litigation for a very long period of time. That has to stop. It has to be very discreet, and only in rare cases that the revenue should keep filing appeals before the higher authorities. And at the end of it, I think to a large extent, if this piece of the administration is also addressed in the law, with quick clarifications being issued by the government wherever there are differences of opinion, to say what the government's viewpoint is, and the law is clarified to that extent, I think it will go a long way in reducing litigation, tax litigation in this country.
Indeed, and who likes litigation in any case? Mr. Deshmukh, I will give you a quick last question, but please make it brief because I've overshot on my time already. In some sense, we were talking about the danda with the tax department, but there also is perhaps a case of carrot and not just the stick approach. I mean, look at what countries across the world do. People wear paying taxes as a badge of honor. In Japan, they can click pictures with the emperor. In Korea, they can be using airport lounges, free parking, and you know, various such things. In Philippines, there's a lottery system. Isn't this also an incentive, and should India not look at carrot besides stick? I mean, I know you would want to overhaul it completely, but given the realities on pragmatism of where we live, if we were to continue with these taxes and the code is being rewritten, how will you believe the carrot will work?
Basically, the code is going to be written, no doubt about it. But the thing is that Arthakranti has given the proposal and another aspect of the taxation, which is a very good taxation system for India. And Arthakranti believes in giving the solution. There are so many problems discussed by so many participants, and I am listening to it since 45 to 50 minutes, that all problems are being discussed, but there is no solution is being discussed. So in my opinion, the Arthakranti has given the solution to the entire problems that has been discussed or that is being discussed right over here. So whatever it is, directly or indirect tax, whether it is in Philippines, what you had discussed just now, or whatever the things are there, the only radical solution is Arthakranti, is of course my opinion, and we believe in it. Yes, it has to be there.
To do a debate on each of those specific solutions you have given, and I'm sure you'll join us on that panel and give more time to that as well. But thank you for joining us, Mr. Deshmukh, Mr. Shaktikanta Das. Really appreciate you taking the time and joining us in the India Development Debate. M.R. Venkatesh and Pranav Sehta as well. Thank you so much for joining us in this edition of the India Development Debate. Supriya?
Indeed. Now, Benjamin Franklin once said that death and taxes are the only two certainties. And if that's true, so be it, because there is a crying need to widen the tax base in India. For how long can the middle class be burdened alone? We as a nation must spread awareness on why paying taxes is important. We can't just look at the government to spend and criticize it and in turn shy away from holding our end of the bargain, which is to pay taxes and paying them honestly.
For us, this just isn't another debate. The 18 Tax Pledge will relentlessly do all it takes to persuade all those who should be paying taxes but aren't. They're accountable as Indians, because being nationalist is not just about saying Bharat Mata Ki Jai, but about paying taxes to develop this country. Thanks for being with us on this edition of the India Development Debate.